Bienvenidos! Today we're going to learn how to learn Spanish sight words and the Spanish alphabet. When we are learning another language, we have to use skills that we used when we were much younger and that we haven't used in a long time. When we were children, we learned English and then we went to school and teachers taught us how to read and we learned how to write, and it's been a really long time since we've actually had to learn a language. So we have to go back and remember some of those skills that we used when we were infants and toddlers, because that's where real language learning took place. Now I'm going to show you a word in Spanish and I'm just going to illustrate to you why we have to use some different techniques. Okay, so when you see this word in Spanish, because you speak English and because you know how to read in English, you're automatically trying to figure out how to pronounce that and spelling that in English. That's just how our brains have been adapted to think. But what we have to do is we have to go back and kind of forget about our English and reprogram ourselves to be able to think automatically in Spanish. So what we have to do is we have to actually not use the sight part of sight words, and I'll explain that in a second. So when we were young, when we were infants and toddlers, we learned words, and then when we went to school, we had sight words where the teachers actually would flash a card and we would recognize that spelling and associate it with a sound. But we already knew the sound and we knew the meaning of the sound. So when we're learning sight words in Spanish, what we really need to do is go back and associate a sound with meaning. Okay, so we have to associate the sound that we're hearing with meaning. And then we also have to develop automaticity. Okay, so automaticity in understanding. When we hear the sound, we know what it means. And also, we want to develop automaticity in production, automaticity in speaking. When we think of that meaning and we need to use that meaning, we want to be able to automatically produce that sound. So automaticity in two ways. Automaticity in listening, when we hear it we know what it means, and automaticity in speaking, that we can automatically produce that sound without having to work too hard at it, without having to think hard about how to form those sounds with our muscles and what it's supposed to sound like. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back and use some of the skills we used as an infant and as a toddler to learn to associate sound with meaning and to develop that automaticity. The first thing we're going to do when we're trying to learn the alphabet and sight words in Spanish is we're going to close our eyes, because we have gotten so used to using our eyes and visually reading and taking visual cues in that it blocks out the listening skills that we used as an infant. So we're closing our eyes at first to really enable our minds to focus in on the listening. Okay, so closing the eyes helps you focus on listening. Sometimes when you're watching a video of somebody pronouncing in Spanish, it's helpful to watch the mouth and see how they're forming those sounds, watching a face. But when you can't watch a face, when you're just doing listening practice of sounds, close your eyes, because you don't need all those visual cues. What you really want to focus in on is the sound, because you're going to listen carefully and then you're going to open your mouth and use muscles in ways that you may not have used them before, or in a long time anyway, and then you're going to try to imitate that sound. Now, a lot of my students, the thing I have to really coach them on is opening their mouth and really trying to project and form those sounds. So don't hesitate to watch other people's mouths when they're pronouncing Spanish to try to understand how they're forming that sound. But I want you to close your eyes also and really focus in on what it sounds like. Now, the way we're going to associate that sound with meaning is you're going to make flashcards, okay? But you're not going to put the Spanish word on the card yet. You're going to put So if you're doing the alphabet, you're going to put the letter of the alphabet on the card and a picture, okay? And that's just on one side of the card. If you're doing sight words, you're going to put the English word with a picture on one side of the card. So, like, I have an example here. So if you're learning the word for two in Spanish, you're going to make a flashcard, and on one side of it, you're going to have the word two, and then you'll have a little picture that means something to you about the word two. So I drew a picture of a letter, of an envelope, and I drew an arrow pointing to the to address on the envelope. Another thing you could do for two, I drew a picture of a gift, okay? So whatever makes sense to you for the word or the letter that you're learning. But don't write any Spanish yet, because what we want to do is we want to master that pronunciation of the Spanish before we see the word. That's how you learn the English sight words. You knew how to pronounce that word already, and then you learned how the word looked when it was spelled. And until you master that alphabet, and until you master some basic sight words, it's really important not to try to sound out Spanish words, because you're going to have a lot of trouble sounding them out correctly, because you're doing English pronunciation still. So once you've mastered the pronunciation of those words or those letters of the alphabet, then go back and write the Spanish word on the back of your flashcard. And then they can become sight words, because you already know how it's supposed to be pronounced. Just like the way you learned sight words in English. You knew how to say it, then you learned what the word looked like when you read it. Now, stick with what we've already talked about in other videos about flashcards. Start small. Just learn 5 or so at a time, okay? Learn 5 letters at a time or 5 sight words at a time. Master those and go back and review often. So if you've learned, 20 sight words, be sure you're going back and reviewing those words that you learned earlier. Have yourself a little schedule and periodically go back and review. Because what we're trying to do is build a body of pronunciation tools that you have, and soon you'll be able to start sight reading, and pronouncing words and sounding them out on your own. When you first start out, it's super important to get that sound right as you can, by trying to listen and repeat and imitate those sounds. Now, there are some other videos that are going to be very helpful to you that I want you to pay attention to. You need to watch the videos on flashcards, the alphabet, and I have sight word videos also. So these videos will be very helpful to you when you're first starting out learning Spanish and you want to get your pronunciation correct.